My name is Claire Melamed. I am Managing Director here at ODI and I'm lucky enough to have the CPAN network as part of my portfolio here, so it's really great to be involved in this session. What we're going to do with the second session is to present, first of all, Anna and Rachel will be presenting the results of the piece of work that we're talking about here, the review of the impact of anti-discrimination measures. And then two colleagues who are on the advisory group, who I'll introduce in a moment, will be giving their particular perspectives from the country and region in which, where their research is based. So, first of all, a number of things. If you haven't already, let me urge you to pick up a copy of the summary brief of the piece of research that we're talking about here, the review of anti-discrimination measures. There are copies outside. There's also a very much longer and weightier document, which those of you with large bags will be able to take home with you if there are any left. And those of you without may prefer to download from the CPAN website. Now, this piece of work really came out of, as many of you know, been involved with the work of the Chronic Poverty Centre for a long time, of really, a concern. The centre obviously started out analysing patterns of poverty and discrimination. And I think as the series of chronic poverty reports have sort of brought out very vividly, in the sense one needs to keep going back and back. One can describe a situation, but then in order to sort of understand how to produce changes, we need to keep going kind of backwards and backwards to understand the causation and really think about different entry points for trying to affect change. So this focus on policies, I think, has really very much come out of the research that's been done in the Chronic Poverty Advisory Network and the Chronic Poverty Research Centre that preceded it. To really understand it, to try to see how broader policy measures, as opposed to more specific programming interventions, can be part of the solution to changing some of the patterns of discrimination and persistent chronic poverty that the project, the network itself, describes around the world. I mean, just having looked at the research and the brief, my sense, and without wanting to preempt my colleagues' much fuller description of the results, is that really what this has come out with is three things. That first of all, to some extent, it is a numbers game. That the anti-discrimination measures that were reviewed have managed to change the numbers, in the sense of the numbers of people in positions of power, in employment, in depending on the particular sector that you're looking at, the numbers have been changed. However, it's less of an outcomes game. That while we've seen changes in numbers, the impact on outcomes, perhaps it's simply a sort of time lag issue, have been less clear. And the third point, I think, that's come out very strongly and also came out this morning in the session was that, in a sense, anti-discrimination also discriminates. That what we haven't, we have entirely unsurprisingly seen that these policies themselves play out in the very complex, different patterns of discrimination that we're seeing in different contexts, and that not all groups have benefited equally, and some groups have benefited hardly at all from some of the policies that we've seen. So I think those would be my three key points to keep in mind as we go through, as I say, the much fuller description of the results that follows. So let me just very quickly introduce the speakers, and then we can get on with the substance. Anna, you have already met this morning. Rachel Marcus, who'll be presenting with her, is a research associate here at ODI, a long history of association with the Chronic Poverty Advisory Network. Then here on my left is, again, someone who I'm sure is very well known to many of you in the room, Professor Sukhodeo Thorat, who is an economist and a professor at the Jawaharlal Nehru University and has I think a long history of moving in and out between academia and NGOs, and a history of both academic research and social activism. And then on his left is Professor Vusi Gumede, who's a professor at the University of South Africa and the head of the Thabo Mbeki African Leadership Institute there, and again has a long distinguished biography that you can read about in the handout on your desk, but characterised again by moving between academia and a sort of more direct involvement in public policy and engagement with the government, particularly in South Africa. So I think we have a great set of people who can talk on the academic side and also had different experiences of actually trying to do some of these things in practice. So I'm excited about the discussion. The speakers will have 10 minutes each to present their particular perspective on what we're talking about here, and then we will have some time for discussions before we can move over to more informal discussions over lunch later on. Anna and Rachel.
Thank you. I think if you look at that one.
Oh, yeah. Thank you.
Have we got the presentation?
Yeah, there we go.
Okay, thank you, everyone. So Anna and I are going to split our presentation. I'll just give an overview of the research method and the sort of top level, the nature of the evidence, and then we'll move on quite quickly into the findings. So as was alluded to in the first session, we set out to do a systematic style review, found that the material was not enormously conducive to doing a systematic review because of much of it being qualitative and discursive and so on. We, however, tried to maintain standards of rigour so that we did ensure that all the studies we looked at, were not simply anecdotal, but did have some analysis of findings and justifications of their conclusions. And we found around 450 relevant studies, but I think I should mention that a lot of those focus primarily on people's experience of discrimination, or they'd present what the legal situation and the policy situation was, but then actually have very little analysis of efforts to of how the legal situation or the policies were affecting any change. They would just sort of counterpose a positive policy with a very bad situation for a socially marginalised and discriminated group, and really showing the disconnect between quite positive policies and the on-the-ground situation. So as we mentioned earlier, we focused on political participation because these are entirely political decisions and political policies, and it is all about the distribution of power. So we were looking at how far measures to enhance marginalised groups' access to power then are a conduit to changing their situation in labour markets and education. We looked at education because of its importance for all sorts of personal transformative reasons, but also its impact on people's economic well-being and how far it acts as a pathway for people who've been able to progress further in education to move out of poverty. And finally, we looked at labour markets because that's a key area in which those income-related transformations also happen. We did look at a much broader concept of poverty, including people's access to health, including their personal sense of being discriminated against, and so on, but found relatively little evidence in those areas. So I won't talk through the theory of change. It's been already alluded to in the first session, and I think it's easier to look at the diagram rather than to try to talk it through. So just to quickly present an overview of where we found our evidence and the evidence gaps, and it's very notable from these slides that there's quite a lot of evidence around women and measures to promote women, largely through political quotas. There's a lot around children and young people, but not generally as a social group in themselves. I mean, almost purely in relation to education. So what we didn't find, for example, was many studies that looked at where there's been an affirmative action policy in labour markets, has that impacted positively on the children of those groups. We found a couple of studies of political reservations that have traced through to impacts on children's nutrition and found some positive impacts, but mostly those were just looking at affirmative action measures in education. And as you can see also, we found a relatively large number around scheduled tribes and scheduled castes in India because of the great volume of literature analysis and data that exists in India. But for other groups, there is very much less. And in particular, as Sarah mentioned in the first session, very little around religious minorities, around sexual minorities, and people with sort of marginalised immigration, citizenship status, refugees, migrants, and so on. Geographically, the material was quite concentrated, a lot of it in middle-income countries, but there is the vast majority from India with a secondary focus on South Africa, but you can also see some clusters of studies from East Africa and a number from China and Malaysia as well, and a little cluster in Latin America, particularly centred around Brazil, but also a few from Peru and other Latin American countries.
Okay, so I'm going to move on now to give you the key messages, and then Rachel and I will talk through each of the areas and the findings. So the first thing that we observed across all areas, the political participation, labour markets and in education, was that the quotas, reservations, things like stipends, so affirmative action programmes can increase representation. So that's definite from the numbers that we've seen. And it happens in all sorts of different ways, but we know that we can increase numbers through those mechanisms. As Alex was saying this morning, it's about much more than that. So that's what we can say from the evidence. We can see that in women in legislative bodies, but also in higher education in East Africa, for example. We see that in Brazil in terms of Afro-Brazilians, in Malaysia and in South Africa. We also see it emphasised again in labour markets and in education and in political participation in India for scheduled castes and tribes and for women. We see then much less evidence, and the literature on women's political inclusion talks about the difference between descriptive representation and transformative representation. So we see quite a lot of descriptive representation, but very little substantial evidence on transformative change, and I'll talk about that in a bit more detail in a moment. Outside of India, we see very little investigation of the impact on beneficiary individuals and designated groups' economic well-being, which sort of refers to Helen's question in the first session. What are the outcomes of some of these measures? So we see very little on that. As Alex already noted this morning, we had a big absence around people with disabilities. Where we did have evidence, we had descriptions of problems, of frustrations, of attempts to get legal frameworks, but very little evidence on implementation. With the exception of one study around Uganda, for example, where there are political quotas for people with disabilities that have increased numbers, but one study on that. What is very noticeable, of course, and we talked about this morning, is fragmentation and the danger of lumping together discrimination and assuming that discrimination happens in the same way to all groups at the same time. That outcomes of discrimination vary considerably by group and by context. These are very specific things and social relationships and relationships of power. Solutions, therefore, are likely also to be very context specific. So it's a very hard area to distill easy policy solutions that can be replicated everywhere. And there's been some quite good, again, I feel like I'm plugging ODI, but some of the studies from the politics and governance team where they've really looked at how did women's quotas work in political representation, and then teasing out the political economy sides, the civil society activism sides to explore how actually change came about. And I think that's what Sarah was also talking about this morning. And then, of course, we've got the intersectionality. Not all members of marginalised groups share the same interests, and group labels can become politically contested. I shall rush on a bit so that we can say something about the different areas. So just quickly on political participation. So increasing the numbers of women is there, but less evidence of transformative change. There's much quoted studies from India, quantitative studies that associate women in local government with increases of public services, for example, water. There's an Esther Dufflow paper that's quoted in many places. Actually, when you go and look at that body of evidence, it's really quite weak. And that study is quoted again and again and again as an evidence base, and it's not. And actually the evidence base there's a lot of quantitative evidence from India, but a lot of it's about very different things, set with different parameters, measuring different areas, and it's quantitative research that glosses over the context. So it's possible that there's some causality links, but it's very difficult to say that. On the other hand, there's some interesting qualitative research that tells us a bit more about the power and the relationships that are going on, some more of the difficulties of what that women leaders face once they get into those sort of positions. I think I'll hand on to Rachel now to tell us more about the other area.
A couple of key points then from education and labour markets. Education was one of the most positive stories in the evidence we looked at. There was good evidence almost across the board of either substantial investment in trying to get marginalised groups into education, or at higher education level, of quotas having some impact on marginalised groups' access to higher education, but also a lot of evidence around the need for complementary measures, financial measures, attitude change, and ensuring that quotas at higher education level were not seen as the only activity around marginalised groups' access to education, because the dropout levels are so stark at lower levels of the education system. I now don't quite remember, but I mean, around sort of 0.5% or something of disabled children, if even that, are making it through to higher education levels. So the dropout levels are profound earlier. The other key point I wanted to make about education is that although the numbers have changed and there's been quite a lot of success in getting children to enrol, and this evidence comes particularly from India around marginalised castes, but also more broadly around disabled children's experience of schooling. Often once they're there, the experience is so discriminatory that they drop out again because they don't want to continue. So that points to the importance of very major attitude change. And one of the areas that our review didn't find very much evidence on was of effective attitude change campaigns, whether those be training for public service providers or more broadly within society. Within labour markets, we found some evidence of successful impacts in India and South Africa in terms of representation of marginalised groups, and in India in particular, evidence of impact on incomes. We've also found evidence of targeted, well-funded youth training schemes in Latin America that have had some success in increasing employment and wages for marginalised young people, and particularly young women. But as with other issues, that's dependent on a positive economic context and a positive policy commitments that are not by any means universally there, and they can't be just lifted out of that context to say they work in general. Anna.
Okay, so I think I won't say too much more about evidence gaps, because I think our colleagues from the advisory group will probably cover those evidence gaps. So just really to finish there.
Thank you very much, both of you. Really, really, really interesting. And as I say, but there's a huge amount more in here and in the whole report to delve down into some of the specific pieces of evidence. But let me now ask Lucy to give you that. Thank you. Do you want the...
Yes, please. I've got a presentation.
Thank you.
Greetings, everyone, and thanks for the opportunity to come here and talk about what I'm going to talk briefly about and can have a discussion. So I'm going to reflect more specifically on, given the findings of the first phase, reflect in the context of South Africa, and particularly inclusive development, in other words, social and economic inclusion of those that were previously excluded. I hope I pressed the correct button here.
Should be that one. Yeah.
Okay, I got it. So the starting point, and I think this is maybe useful background, and we normally take it for granted, but let me just quickly go through over it, that the fundamental issue of colonialism and apartheid in South Africa, and I use a shorthand when I write about this, I call it apartheid colonialism to characterize the 350 years plus minus of discrimination. That is fundamental for any change you want to bring about, because that's a very long time, so over 3 centuries of discrimination, and that to look at development in South Africa, and inclusive development in particular, is useful to think through the ramifications or implications of that discriminatory system. And many people agree with this, or there's consensus broadly in South Africa that progress in South Africa has been constrained largely in the following areas: 1, unemployment, poverty, inequality, and increasingly lately, the challenge that relates to race relations. Many people feeling that race relations are deteriorating, and it's a relatively recent phenomenon of the past plus minus 5 years. Of course, with unemployment, it's always been a challenge, but it's become much more pronounced, poverty and inequality, and I'm going to say a little bit about that. Of course, with inequality, if you look at it from the economic perspective, through the Gini coefficient, South Africa is said to be the leading country in the world. You got to lead on something. This is not a good thing to lead on. And therefore, inclusive development in South Africa will require structural changes, especially in the economy, and maybe people have made this point. But most importantly, that there needs to be rethinking of how the state and the private sector interface, because the private sector seems to be very influential, and it has been since 1994, and many argue that this is a continuation from the apartheid era to the post-apartheid era. The private sector in South Africa has always been very strong, and that change, to bring about change, even the structural change in the economy, you need to reconfigure the relations between the state and capital. I'm going to reflect on this book that just came out last month, which is on inclusive development in South Africa, economic and social inclusion, very briefly. It goes to a lot of detail, and I'm going to highlight the main issues from it. When I asked what is it that I could talk about, I was advised I could reflect on what I've been working on in the context of the report that has just come out. And last year, by the way, I published this book, which probably is more useful than maybe this book, in a sense that it described in a lot of detail the policy work, the various policy areas, in the various political economy areas, about 14 of them, on public enterprises, on poverty, on inequality, and so forth, since 1994. And of course, the other one goes into a lot more detail. So I'm going to reflect on what I've been trying to say about these areas. So even on economic empowerment, I've got a chapter in this other book that describes the various policies that have been undertaken since 1994. So talking about the structure of the Southern economy in particular and the society at large, you could see, I think the testing point is to look at the gross domestic product, although this is not a very good measure of economic development. The point that I would like to make about this slide very briefly is that South Africa has actually not performed as well as some argue. So in a comparative context, if you think of a country very close to South Africa, a 2-hour, 3-hour drive, Botswana has been doing far better in terms of annual GDP growth than South Africa. If you look at Brazil, and often South Africa is compared with Brazil, Brazil has done much better, and many other countries, Malaysia and so forth. And I look specifically here at the period before the full impact of the global economic recession. But even after the global economic recession, you'll see that countries such as maybe here Malaysia, maybe India, who've recovered quicker than South Africa. South Africa has just recently gone into a full recession. It's been on decline for a while, which implies that there's something that needs to be done on the economy. And this issue of structural changes that needs to take place in the economy. I could go into a lot more detail later on if there's an opportunity to talk about that. With regards to unemployment, the most affected groups in South Africa is the youth and women, as these numbers show. And I think it's agreed that things may be getting worse. I look at the period until 2011, of course, in the book, where the data was more reliable at that point in time. But if you look at the post-global economic crisis context, you'll imagine that things have gotten worse. Of course, the numbers for unemployment rate in South Africa have shot up significantly. And some of us argue that this is not only because of the global economic recession. The economy started taking a knock from around 2006, 2007, and the full impact around 2008 before the full global economic crisis impact. And this, I argue in the book, is because we didn't reform the economic policies on time. We kept similar policies, economic policies, even today. Initially, the idea was to stabilize the economy, which was very important because the economy had many problems before democracy. But after the economy stabilized around 1999 or so, there were never many major changes in the economy. And I was involved, by the way. I was in government a lot of that period until 2009, and I can say something about that. Another important issue, I think, is maybe to look at human development very broadly, to show that actually South Africa's human development index has not changed relative to other countries. You see countries that started very low, such as India, almost catching up. You look at Brazil, started more or less the same time with South Africa around 1990, doing far better. You look at countries very close to South Africa, such as Botswana, who've overtaken South Africa and so forth. So the economy has not grown significantly. And on the other hand, the human development index has not changed much if you look at these numbers. But of course, poverty remains very high, and then inequalities that have increased. I think I can pass this slide. I wanted to show just with regards to life expectancy, which had been declining until about 2011. And very interestingly, in the context of education, that there's always been a gap in South Africa, which seems to have increased between what is expected to be a number of schooling and the average years of schooling. And that gap has remained about 5 years of schooling, which actually has its own implications for human development and inclusion. The Gini coefficient, and this is a contested number, I look at this from the consumption side, which suggests actually that, contrary to what many people have been arguing in the context of South Africa, that the economic inequality has to do with class, this slide suggests that it may have to do with race, which means this point I've been making about structural changes in the economy and also apartheid colonialism, that may be a very important point to confront. Because, for instance, if you look at within the population group, African population group, the economic inequality increased, and I argue here it must have been a correction in the labor market between 1995 and 2005. But from there on, it seems to have stabilized relative to other population groups. Again, from the perspective of anti-discrimination, thank you, and inclusion, there are these major service delivery protests that take place in South Africa. Of course, this slide, it's in the book, and I did it before the book was published. So 2015 is only up to May. But what it shows is that there's been a significant increase in service delivery protests in South Africa. They are characterized as major if those protests involve communities where they oppose the pace and the quality of service delivery. And it's been increasing, and they're becoming more violent. They're affecting even the higher education sector lately, the schools that do can bend down or some of the properties. So maybe one point here, than to go into all sorts of details around the policies. The issue really, I think, about South Africa, if we take the context of giving of apartheid colonialism and what needs to happen in the economy, is that the society needs a consensus about how it should develop. There's a point that I emphasize and elaborated extensively in the book, that we need to agree how we're going to pursue socio-economic development, because most importantly, you need the private sector on board, and there need to be a consensus between the state and the private sector, as the state cannot do it alone. And given the nature of our political settlement, it has to be negotiated. So government can't just decide to do as it pleases. Similarly, the private sector needs to come to the party. And lastly, these were the issues from the report. I wanted to reflect very briefly. In summary, that the report indicated that anti-discrimination measures are not resulting to improve well-being or reducing poverty and so forth. And my point is that maybe we do need to look more closely to various aspects of human development. Already education is covered from what we're doing, but there are others that are critically important that we may need to look at. Secondly, is that to really ensure inclusive development for anti-discrimination to be effective, you need an overarching development approach in whose center I argue you need transformative social policy. And there's a point that Jimmy Atesina, Tandem Kandawere, and many others have argued in order to address the structural issues such as the changes in the economy, the changes in the labor market, and so forth. And of course, I've got some few inputs for the second phase, but I think that I'll park for the afternoon. Thanks.
Thank you so much. Really, really interesting. Let me quickly, to make sure we have plenty of time for discussion, move on to Professor Thorat and ask you for your contribution. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me here to say a few things about the anti-discriminatory policy studies and its impact on chronic poverty. Well, let me share with you my observation. couple of points as a matter of preliminary remark. I think as Anne made a point out in the morning, in the first session, that this is an sort of an extension of a chronic poverty approach and programs, where there is a realization that, and that's a very important realization, that poor is not an homogeneous category, but it's an heterogeneous category. There are poor within the poor, and there are poor who are subject to discrimination or excluded from these various sphere. One particular feature is recognized in the study and as well as elsewhere, is that there is a poverty level of the discriminated group is much higher than their counterpart from non-excluded group. Poverty of women is higher than that of male, or poverty of black is higher than that of white in some countries. Similarly, in my own countries, poverty of the ethnic and the low caste is much higher than that of their counterpart from higher caste. Now, this recognition is very important, and I think that is the beginning point for this particular study, which we need to appreciate. And the second step is that indirectly it recognizes that discrimination and exclusion in participating in opportunity is the reason as to why excluded group lag behind compared to the non-excluded poor. And therefore, in a number of countries, there are policies for them. There are anti-poverty, anti-discriminatory policies, which are group focus, specifically try to overcome the constraint faced by the discriminated group, women and ethnic and racial and other minorities. So I think this needs to be complemented. This needs to be appreciated. This is a fantastic job. 450 papers, countries across the continent. And I have gone through the report line by line, and I see that one of the most beautiful aspects of this report is that the authors has reviewed each of the studies. They have not concluded alone, but they have given each of the study their finding, and then they try to draw the conclusion by putting it together. So it's a very important study, in my view, covering three aspects: political, education, and labor market. Now, given the constraint, I would not go into greater detail. What I will focus is mostly on the additional issues that is posed and that it demands for more studies. And those are also, in a way, the limitation that comes out of the review of the study. Now, on political participation for women, I think the studies mostly cover women at local level. 85 countries have affirmative action policies at a local level. The general conclusion is that the political participation has been less transformative in nature, and less and more authoritative, more dominated by the male gender constitution as yet. The positive outcome is in the area which concern women. For example, water has come out very well. The local women leaders focus more on supply of water because it's really concerned to them. Now, my one or two comments of mine on this is that less transformative nature of this political participation of women is a realistic finding. It could not have been otherwise, because you made a beginning. There is a resistance for the participation of women into political process and governance. Through an active policy, you made a beginning, and resistance continue because gender bias continue in a society. So less effort, less transformative is likely to be there because of gender biases. There are positive gain, I think, which we need to recognize and which give direction for the further studies. First thing is there is a space for women now in political domain, leading to participation, self-confidence. Now, recognizing this constraint itself is a positive result of the study, so that you can build up further policies. That mere giving political participation is not good enough, but you require something supplementary to make their role effective. And in Indian context, I recognize, for example, is that capabilities are very necessary. There are a number of studies which take educational level of the woman who is the head of the panchayat and study the effectiveness of the participant is closely related with the education level. They can read, they can assert, they can they can sign. So education is important. Freedom is very important to take decision, but equally important is the electoral method. How they are elected. Are they elected through an electoral mechanism whereby they are dependent on others and not on the voter as such? So I think these are some of the issues which are very, very important. The only limitation or the aspect that I would say, it's not the limitation of the studies, simply because there are no studies, is that it's only focused on women by and large. But affirmative action policy other than women is a major policy which is there in India, for example. We have a reservation policy in politics, 16% for scheduled caste, 8% for scheduled tribe in the parliament. Constituencies are identified, and there are a large number of countries, I think China and others. So in future, what we'll require is to take ethnic groups and other groups and see as to how they are effective. And one more point I'll make, and I'll stop for political issue, is that yes, they are less transformative in the nature that what changes they bring out. But there are several invisible channels through which women makes impact. At least for the Indian context, I do know that they are the member of the committees, they are the member of the policy committees, they are the member of the monitoring committee. It is at that level where the resistance is much less, that they interact with the policy maker, make the suggestion, reports are prepared, submitted to the government, and the policies are changed. So I think this silent, invisible contribution of political process because of the affirmative action is very necessary. Mark Galanton has a book, who is a US lawyer, legal expert, has a book where he has studied this invisible aspect. Now let me come to education very quickly. So these are some of the comment in Indian context. Now education, of course, the studies have brought out very nicely that affirmative action policy has helped. In India, of course, it has definitely helped because there are quotas in public institutions of a desirable course, not all. Where there are no scarcity of seats, there is no affirmative action policy. In school, I don't think there is affirmative action policy is applicable because the admission is open. But in a desirable of courses, desirable institution, affirmative action policy directly given access to the meritorious student, whereby you can have access to education. But I think studies rightly point out the problem of dropouts, problem of poor academic performance, because these are the students who come from poor family background, their family capability is much less, so dropout rate is much higher. If they are taught in mother tongue languages, if there is a pre-coaching and some assistant in the school, the performance is better. I think very good finding of the studies, I think, I would suggest. And but there are issues that they need to understand. I think they have highlighted. In-school discrimination is area which has not been examined, and their impact on academic performance, their desire not to go to the school, withdrawals at a psychological level. Secondly, one of the features that Indian feature, and I have a feeling elsewhere also, that this affirmative action policy is confined to public school and not to private. In India, there is no affirmative action policy for private education system and private employment. Of the total employment in India, only 20% is public and 80% is private, where there is no affirmative action policy. Impact has to be seen in that context also. So I think these are some of the issues as far as education is concerned. Let me quickly finish the labor market. Studies bring out that there is a evidence of impact of labor market affirmative action policy on income and poverty, but there are less number of studies, even for India. There has been a general neglect by the mainstream academics undertaking rigorous studies on the impact of affirmative action policy in labor employment. So, but there is a huge scope. I will submit that in country like India, we have a national sample survey data which was made available only in 2000. Before that, we could not undertake study. But now there is enough scope to undertake studies on jobs under reservation and their impact on income and employment. And that can be certainly done. But there are 3 points that I would like to submit for the consideration, is that when you study the impact, the criticism of affirmative action policy is that it's picked up individuals and elite benefits, selected individual benefit. That's also a problem of South Africa. Black economic empowerment is now renamed as broad-based black economic empowerment to cover the poorer section also. So I think there are methodological issues. I have written in one of my very recent paper, individual mobility through reservation in job lead to group mobility. The social return of reservation is much higher than the individual benefit. One person get a job, he pulls up his family member. So the social return is much higher. So I think we need to have new studies on and new methodologies to study the impact of affirmative action policy in employment in terms of social returns, and also covering the private sector. The most beautiful thing this study has brought out is, in my view, is the following, and that is they have listed the gaps. Very nice. Politics of implementations. Yeah, there is a huge resistance. Second is resistance by the bureaucracy to implement the reservation. That is because in society, those who are in policy and bureaucracy are the high caste in India. And it is they who resist the implementation of it. And that's a whole lot of area which need to be examined. There is a constant opposition to the policy which need to be examined. That is the political economy of affirmative action policy. Role of civil societies. I think they have highlighted that there are hardly any studies which examine, but there is a huge literature, let me tell you. I think one of the limitations of this study, as has been pointed by Sarah, is also the access to the national literature. First thing, books are excluded to a large greater extent, reports are excluded, material by the NGOs are excluded, locally published, in local language as well as in English, and that has some of this aspect, but I think obviously we could not have done that. But I think at a country level study, a role of civil society in promoting the affirmative action policy will be necessary. Intersecting of inequalities is a very important issue which the studies have highlighted. Yes. For example, reservation policy benefit relatively economically better off. That is what is being argued. And I argued that that's not true in my article. But nevertheless, those who benefit and became economically mobile, there should be exit for them from reservation policy. So the issue of economic versus caste discrimination. And my position on this is that economic advantage should be withdrawn. But what about reservation? Because discrimination is neutral to your economic standing. A woman who is rich or a poor is subject to discrimination because of gender. A black, better off or worse off, face discrimination in many areas. So I think that's a hardcore issue. And there is a superfluous argument that, economic mobility will reduce the discrimination. So you need a lot of studies on this, to what extent economic capacity of an individual enable him to overcome discrimination, and then ask them to go for exit. One of the points that I share with one of the authors is that I think it would have been better had we taken 3-4 advanced countries, USA, Japan, and possibly Northern Ireland. So we could have understood that what happens in an advanced country to affirmative action policy with economic mobility. Japan is the singular case that they implemented affirmative action policy for Borak women for 20-25 years and withdrew it. Because they think that there is no need now. Economic progress and working of the market can take care of them with some protection. So I think that should have also been there, but I think there is a limitation of it. Well, I will finish now. I think these are some of the issues, and all these issues can be examined in Indian context. I have not spoken much about India, but I think the impact of the labor market policies on income, poverty, from individual mobility to group mobility, so we can really capture what affirmative action policy can make, their role in the private sector. The resistance of the high caste in implementing is a very key issue. Because, the Dr. Ambedkar, who was the architect of this policy, he did not ask only for anti-discriminatory measure, he did not ask only law against untouchability or a discrimination, but also affirmative action policy to get an equal access in employment, education, and politics. And that's how we have this. But the third aspect is that what do you do about bureaucracy? Once you have a law, once you have a policy, but high caste bureaucracy would not implement it, resist it. We have an agency, SC/ST Finance Commission, and they get thousands and thousands of cases and complaints by the high caste, by the low caste about their discrimination. So he had proposed remedies against discrimination by the bureaucrats, but it was not accepted. He also proposed remedies against the legislature. If your legislature is dominated by the high caste senator, the policies would not come that easily. So he had certain policies which would safeguard the interests. For example, all parliament are dominated by men, and that's why the policies which are in favor of female get resistance. So what safeguard you want to have? He had suggested that all major decisions should be taken by male and female, or majority and minority parties. So I think there are a number of issues which can be examined in the Indian context further, but I really compliment that this has opened up the gateway.
Thank you so much.
Sorry.
Really, really interesting and a great, I think that example at the end is very much to the point that, you know, this is partly about having the laws, but very much about actually implementing the laws and thinking through the kind of institutional consequences of that. So thank you to all of you. I think that was really fascinating kind of spread from the sort of big picture about the sort of these, you know, the aggregate statistics in South Africa demonstrating some of the kind of economic trends that we're talking about and confronting here, and then some of these very specific examples. I think that was really useful. We have just, I'm happy to say we have just under half an hour for questions and comments, so we can have a good discussion. I mean, obviously feel free to ask about any of the sort of specific examples and any clarification you want, but just from my side, I think I'm left with three kind of questions coming from those different presentations. First of all, this point about social norms and about building the kind of social norms among individuals, and also building the broader social consensus about how development should happen and what kind of society is being created here. And I'm, I suppose, left with a sort of question about causality, about the role of some of these policies that we're talking about here in the sort of causal relationship between policies as a way of shifting social norms and building that social consensus, and the extent to which policies are an outcome of those changing norms. And I mean, clearly it's both, but it's interesting to reflect on the sort of, in different sectors, in different moments, what is the function that policy can make in either changing or kind of consolidating changes in some of these deep-rooted social norms that, as several people have said, are the kind of partly at the heart of this. The second point that I'm left with, that I think many of us might want to reflect on from a perspective of researchers, but even more for those of you in the room who are from NGOs and others who are focused more on advocacy, is the kind of implications of this research and the different things that we've talked about for strategy. I mean, clearly, you know, choosing to focus on either the arguments about the agreement or the implementation of laws around anti-discrimination is a political choice, and it has an opportunity cost in that it means you're not focusing on something else. So my question to you, and it's a genuine question that I'm left very uncertain about having heard all of this, is when is that a useful thing to do? When should activists who are looking to promote equality, to eradicate discrimination, be focusing on these legalistic routes? And when is that not a good strategy? And actually we should be, and when does the evidence here suggest that that's not a useful strategy and we should be thinking about something else? And there's obviously questions here, you know, in an ideal world we do everything all the time, but we all know that we can't. So what does this suggest about priorities? I think is interesting. And then, of course, the third thing is where we ended on gaps from our selfish perspective as researchers here. And, you know, I know there's commitment to do more work on this. We've heard a lot about the different gaps that this research has revealed. Again, I'm interested in people's views about what the priorities are. What would be most useful from your different perspectives as a guide to action, as a guide to implementation of projects and so on, to know that we currently don't know, that would have the most value in terms of helping to inform policy and practice. So those are my three questions to open the discussion. I'm interested in people's comments, questions to the panel, or your own comments and perspectives on any of that. Please be brief, please introduce yourselves if you haven't spoken already, and the floor is yours. Thank you. Who's going to be brave? Okay, two. Please, you there.